And welcome to Based on a True Story, the podcast that compares your favorite Hollywood movies with history. That belongs in a museum. It's not the years, honey. It's the mileage. You're a teacher? Can you guess what we're talking about today? That's right. We're going to learn about Indiana Jones, and not just one Indiana Jones movie, but all of them. That means we have 5 different movies to cover today. So let's kick this off with an overall synopsis of the entire franchise. It all starts with 1981's Raiders of the Lost Ark, where we saw archaeologist and Professor Indiana Jones being chased by Nazis as they're looking for the Ark of the Covenant just before the outbreak of World War II. Then, in 1984, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom showed Indiana, Willie, and Short Round braving the lair of the supernatural thuggee cult that was enslaving children from local villages in India. After that, 1989's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade went back to Indy against the Nazis as they're both searching for the Holy Grail that promises to give eternal life to anyone who drinks from it. Well, I guess you could argue that Indiana was mostly looking for his father, who got captured by the Nazis while looking for the Grail. But then, after that, for a long time, we didn't get anything new until, in 2008, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull was released to tell the tale of Indiana, Marion, and their son, Mutt, as they're off to search for another supernatural artifact in a telepathic crystal skull. And this time, they're not racing against the Nazis to find the skull, but the movie is set in the 1950s, so it is the Soviet Union who are the villains in this one. And last, but certainly not least, the 5th and what the filmmakers have said is the final film in the franchise, 2023's Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. That brings the Nazis back into the picture as they are trying to find a legendary time-traveling artifact to go back in time and allow the Nazis to rise again and change the course of history. With such a wide range of topics covered across the Indiana Jones franchise, I am excited to be joined by the perfect person to help us unravel it all. Neil Laird is the TV director and executive producer on over 100 programs and counting for National Geographic, BBC, Discovery, PBS, and more. In other words, Neil has been to many of the actual locations, and his wide range of programs have covered the real history behind things we see in the Indiana Jones franchise. On top of his work as a director and producer, Neil just released his latest book that's a perfect complement to the mix of fact and fiction in the Indiana Jones franchise. Neil's newest book is Primetime Pompeii, Part 2 in his Jared Plummer vs. the Ancient World series. And this time, obviously, it's Pompeii. Hop into the show notes to grab your copy of Neil's latest book, and I'll include a link to Part 1 that's called Primetime Travelers in case you need to catch up. While you grab your copy in another browser tab, and before we connect with Neil, let's set up our game, 2 truths and a lie. Now, if you're new to the show, here's how it works. I'm going to give you 3 things. 2 of them are true, and that means one of them is just an all-out lie. Are you ready? Okay, here they are. Number 1, Tanis, the place we see Indy searching for the Ark of the Covenant, is actually a real location. Number 2, Temple of Doom has the most historically accurate of the artifacts that Indiana Jones is searching for in the franchise. Number 3, there is more than one crystal skull. Got him? Okay, now as you're listening to our story today, your challenge is to identify which one is the lie, and I've got the answer right here in this envelope that will open at the end to reveal and see how well you did. All right, now it's time to connect with Neil Laird about the historical accuracy of Indiana Jones. We have a lot to cover today with 5 different Indiana Jones movies. But before we get started digging into some of the more historical details, something I like to do here is to take a step back and get an overall letter grade for the historical accuracy of a movie. Now, we have multiple movies today, so I'd love to ask you kind of a letter grade for each one. Let's start with the first movie released in the franchise. What letter grade would you give Raiders of the Lost Ark based on its historical accuracy?
Yeah, let's clarify that, because obviously they're not talking about the quality, the fun of the film, like the historical, which is obviously 2 different things. Which is, tricky, but sometimes I do go in concert. I would say with Indiana Jones, I would give it a solid B, the first one.
Okay, okay. And then how about the next film, Temple of Doom?
Temple of Doom would have to be a D.
D? Okay, so a bit of a drop there. And then The Last Crusade is the next.
That would be a B.
B? Okay, so coming back.
We'll talk about C+ or a B. It's on the fridge.
Okay. And then almost 20 years later, we got another Indiana Jones with 2008's Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. What grade does that one get?
It 20 years to work on that, and they come back with an F.
I had a feeling that would be another drop. And then last but certainly not least, the final film in the franchise, at least as of this recording, we'll see if they change that too, is 2023's Dial of Destiny. What historical letter grade does that one get?
I would say that's probably a C plus as well. Maybe if I'm generous, I'll give it a B. It's up there with sort of Last Crusade and that one. Both have some interesting concepts. They sort of fudge a bit. So we get into details. We'll talk about that dividing line.
Okay, yeah. So we have a little bit of a roller coaster there with the whole franchise. Nice. All right, let's start digging into each of the movies now, starting with 1981's Raiders of the Lost Ark. It's the first one that's not the Indiana Jones, and then the rest are. But according to the movie, the Lost Ark, and the title is the Ark of the Covenant, and Indiana Jones explains the basic concept in a scene at the beginning of the film. In a nutshell, the Ark is where the Israelites held the 10 Commandments that were given to Moses on Mount Sinai from the book of Exodus in the Christian Bible. It's not just a historical artifact, though, according to the movie, because the story that they tell suggests that the Israelites used the power of God associated with the Ark to defeat their enemies. And since the movie is set in 1936, when the Nazis are rising to power, Hitler wants to find the Ark to basically make his armies invincible. And that's how the movie kind of sets up the whole concept for why Indiana Jones is trying to find the Ark for the United States government before the Nazis do. Do we know if the Ark of the Covenant was a real historical artifact, and was it really something that Hitler looked for as the Nazis were rising to power?
Well, it's interesting. The reason I gave this one a B is why there is no Ark today, and of course, no one in contemporary times has seen it. It's one of the most well-documented of all the artifacts we talk about in this series because it was in the Bible. It actually goes back to biblical days, unlike the rest of them. And they're quite descriptive in what they talk about how big it is, the cubits, and where it was housed. And, you know, the book of Exodus gets very, very particular on all the sordid engineering details. Doesn't mean that it was a real thing, but it certainly means they believed in it. And if you follow the story through the other chapters of the Bible, they do talk about once they get to the Holy Land, how it becomes this scourge, and it's stolen by the Philistines, and they all get attacked by plague and rats so much that they give it back. And then these Israelites, when they take it home, someone dares to look at it and they die. They get struck down by lightning, very close to melting. So clearly, I think the writers of Raiders read their Bible and know the lore. And I think that's why it's so strong in terms of, if not historical, at least the history of the telling of the Ark. You know, take away the fact whether it existed or not. They did their research, and they really are writing to what the writers of the Bible and the New Testament and some of the other apocryphal authors wrote at the time. Now, what the other question, whether Nazis looked for it, they were looking for everything at that point. You know, the Nazis were just chasing everything down, and a lot of it was because they do believe in the spirit, the supernatural, but they also wanted to get anything that gave them the up on religion and obviously telling people they have something. A lot of it was propaganda. It wasn't just they believed that they were going to harness the force of Yahweh. It was to get the local population to say, look what we have. You know, it was as much telling you we're giving you something as valuable as it was trying to use it for nefarious purposes. But like the other ones we'll talk about later, there's no specific information saying they were looking for the Ark particularly. They were looking for anything that they could exploit in the occult or in the biblical or in the spiritual and the Christian world to prop themselves up.
So make sure I'm understanding it. It's not as much that they were looking for it to lead their armies necessarily, but almost like as long as their armies or whoever their followers were believed that it had the power, it didn't even matter if they actually had the power itself. Like you see the lightning in the movie, right? The idea of that concept. As long as people believe, then it sounds like that's what the Nazis were going for.
Yeah, I think it's part of it. Probably not unlike the people who wrote the Bible. Whether those people who wrote that believed that the Ark had these supernatural things, but if the people who think that we are the ones who are housing it have those power, then you're going to listen to us as well. So it's both ways. There may have been people who already believed in the supernatural, in the occult aspect of it, but just as many were cynical people trying to manipulate the populace.
Another huge part in the Indiana Jones search for the Ark in Raiders revolves around the lost city of Tanis. In the movie's version of history, Tanis was buried by a huge sandstorm back in like 980 BC until Rene Belloc discovers Tanis, presumably just before the movie's timeline, because the Nazis financed Belloc's excavation to find the Ark there at Tanis. Is there really a historical connection between the city of Tanis and the Ark?
In a word, no. I admire they picked Tanis. Now, again, I think we talked about this up top. I'm an archaeologist, I'm not an archaeologist, but I do all these shows about them. So I've done tons of shows in Egypt. That's my happy place. I probably shot maybe 20, 30 films there. I've been there a lot. I've been to Tanis a couple of times as well. But mostly never about the Ark. Tanis is a real place. It's up in the Delta, which is northeast of Alexandria. And it from the late period of Egypt. So it's the 19th, 20th dynasty on, which meant anything to the layman. But it was post King David and the Holy period. But it wasn't a place that was wiped off the face of the earth by a sandstorm. It basically just crumbled when the Egyptian Empire crumbled. The late period got ransacked by 600 BC by the Persians, and it kind of disappeared from history. Mostly like lots of these ancient cities, not because it got lost, because it got dismantled, it got abused. People took the temples and reused them to make a donkey shed. It basically got repurposed. And it's a fascinating city because they did find, one more quick aside, besides the King Tut tomb, which is the only known unlooted tomb in ancient Egypt, the other one was found in Tanis, but much later, a pharaoh called Shoshank II. And you find all the gold and all the mummies and all the trappings there, just like King Tut. But it's a much poorer time in history. So it's very interesting that people don't know about it. You can see all this stuff when you go to the Cairo Museum, but it lost its luster because King Tut looms bigger. And also, ironically, it was found just before the rise of World War II. So as soon as it was found, the Nazis swept in, and it never really got the press, and people couldn't excavate it again, all that kind of stuff. So it just sort of slunk off into oblivion. So it's a long answer to say no. There's no connection at all to the Ark there. It is a real town, and interesting enough too, even before I went to Egypt, when I was watching this film as a kid, it never quite felt right. It feels like a set. If you go to Egypt as a tourist or as a filmmaker, an archaeologist, one thing you'll quickly learn is it's not the sand dunes. It's not the soft sand that we think of in the Sahara. It's a harder, darker, more well-trodden land. So you look at the Tanis in Raiders, it feels like it's the rolling hills and up there, and there's very few artifacts. If you go to the modern Tanis, it's big and flat and brown, and there's no sands, there's no dunes at all because it doesn't get that. It's too close to the Delta. It's a little too marshy, so it doesn't even feel like the real Tanis. Again, does it matter to people who are watching on a Saturday afternoon with popcorn? No. And conversely, that's a terrible representation of Cairo in that film. Cairo looks nothing like that Cairo. That is like a small town in Algeria or something.
Really?
You didn't ask that question. I have to throw that in there. That is a poor representation of 1930s Cairo.
No, I think that's a great point. And that was something you already kind of mentioned with Tanis, but we see a lot of archaeology in the movie, and you just kind of get the sense that this is what Egyptian archaeology looked like there. I know, granted, in the 1930s, but still, I think a lot of people are influenced by what you see in Raiders as this must be what it looks like there.
And again, it's more towards the more trained eye, having been to the site so often. I can feel when it looks more romantic and more dramatic in the film than it does. It's flatter and more well-trodden and not quite as pretty, not quite as exotic.
Doesn't look as well on film.
There's a lot of modern concrete tower blocks just out of view, Yeah. Gas stations and stuff.
Now, almost every movie is going to have some plot holes. I think one of the most popular ones that I know of from Raiders of the Lost Ark has to do with just the idea that Indiana Jones himself really had no impact on the outcome of the film. The Nazis would have found the Ark and all died at the end from God's power from the Ark anyway. But since this is more kind of focusing on the history side of things, I have to ask, does Raiders have a major plot hole that really stood out to you from a historical perspective?
That's historical. I wouldn't say not beyond them playing so fast and loose with the facts. I think to me, even as a kid, I remember this. Again, today's my 58th birthday, so I saw all these movies in the theater. So I remember seeing Raiders and Temple of Doom, which we'll talk to in a few minutes in the theater. And I remember thinking as a kid, a huge plot point then was, well, if Temple of Doom is a prequel and he discovers all this magic and all the supernatural stuff a year before Raider. Why doesn't he believe any of it when he's in Raider? Why is he such a bloody skeptic? Just last year, you watched a guy have his heart ripped out and a bunch of gods and zombies attacking you. A year later, you forgot about all that?
It's a
big plot point.
That is a very good point that I didn't even think about, that, because it is a prequel. And yeah, no, that's... He forgot. We just all have that happening to us all the time.
Yeah,
it's just one of those things,
what was
right?
happening last year? There was the Ark and a couple birthdays and the taxes. You forget about it.
Yeah, he slept since then. All right, since you mentioned Temple of Doom, that is the next one. It came out in 1984, but it is a prequel. It happens the year prior to what we saw in Raiders. And so we're not seeing Nazis anymore. This one is Indiana Jones looking for the Sankara stones, which, according to the movie, are powerful and sacred artifacts tied to the Hindu legend. Now, when they're stolen from a village, that triggers Indiana Jones to go searching for them. Is there any truth to the legend of the Sankara stones that we see in the movie?
No, it's totally fictional. I mean, in all of them, I think this is the one that is the most fictionalized. It's not really based on anything. Even when we get to the crystal skulls and we talk about how dubious some of the facts are there or lack thereof, at least it was based on something we can hold. There were the lingam stones, Shiva lingam stones, are very common. You see them if you go to any Hindu temple. And they're just sort of like, and I'm not a Hindu scholar, but I think they represent the sort of shapelessness of earth and God and creation, the creation stones. So that was all totally fictionalized in terms of the diamond and all that, totally fictionalized for the film, which I think is one of its biggest flaws because it also doesn't really have that gravitas. It doesn't really make much sense. You don't know what it does. It somehow it helps people control kids and enslave them, and then when you get them back, they're no longer slaves. It's pretty murky in terms of what his power is as well. But no, it is totally fictional, and there's nothing in terms of 5 stones that have to be put together.
Okay. Yeah, that's... I guess maybe it doesn't have all that, like you were saying, building off the biblical lore and things that people already know as they're watching this, and they might not know the details of it, but they know enough of it to know that, oh, Tanis, that's a real place. I know that's a real place. I know the Ark Covenant was a thing. I don't know what it does, but that kind of thing. You can get that with the Sankara stones. Okay.
Yeah, it's like, again, I do archaeology programs like over 1,000 hours of TV, 100 shows, and I've done all the other stories multiple times. I've never done a lingam show. So it also shows you there's really nothing there. There's no real there other than if you want to do a story about religion and about spirituality. But the idea of that having some sort of magical property, even people looking for it doesn't really even have that holy grail quest where people are trying to find some classic stone. It's just a total McMuffin.
Okay. Well, speaking of searching, I have to ask, Indiana Jones discovers the Thuggee cult is behind all of this. And according to the movie, they're a secret society who worship the goddess Kali, which is where the Temple of Doom comes in because that's a temple for sacrificing humans to Kali. But the movie suggests that the Thuggee cult was eradicated by the British in the 19th century when they colonized India. Is there a true story behind the Thuggee cult that we see in the movie?
There was a Thuggee cult. It's really fascinating. I have not done a film on that, but I have read about it. And the Thuggees were a real group of people, but they were bandits. They were not so much a cult. That kind of came later, but basically between, I think, the 1800s and up until the British sort of came in and roughshod everyone, they were highway bandits, and they were known for strangling their victims, and they became quite notorious. And I do think there's some truth to the fact that they were actually true serial killers. There's one, I forget his name, who claimed to have killed 900 people before he was caught, which would make him the most notorious serial killer ever. And traditionally, they always did it through strangulation. And one of the theories is that there was some Hindu, prophecy, some sort of law they wanted to follow where we never shed blood. You can kill, but never shed blood. You strangle somebody, there's no blood. It's one theory. But the British, when they did come in, the Raj, they came in, they did eradicate them. And that's when things get murky because when it's being written by the winners, you don't know exactly how much they added. The British might have exaggerated. They may have made a religious cult and leaned into the Kali thing because they wanted to dismiss and denigrate the local religions. So while there might have been people who did follow those cults, some of them are also Muslim as well. So you can't say they were all devotees of some cult. At the end of the day, they were just really nasty highway bandits who would kill for anything.
Okay. Yeah, it sounds like a lot of fictionalization in there, but maybe that's where the filmmakers were hoping that was the nugget of truth that people would latch onto and recognize.
I'm impressed they brought them up because they're pretty obscure. I don't know if people listening to this in India will know more, but it's not something you hear too much about here in the West. So I do admire that film, at least for going to India, which isn't something we normally do in the West, and for talking about things like the Thuggees, because we don't usually, we usually deal in the West. We usually stick in the West. So it's great to actually they went a bit far afield. The biggest problem with that film is it's of all the films, it's the great white savior film. It's like a poor town that has to bring the white guy over from Yale or wherever to solve a problem they couldn't possibly solve on their own. And if you look at it today, the racism and the way they dismiss the Indians and where this one white guy and his shrill sidekicks, save an entire nation is really kind of hard to stomach. It makes it a tough watch for me.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah, and that's something that I wonder how much of that is them going into well, of course, the movie is released in the 80s, so you're going to have some of that too, but then also going back to they're talking about British colonialism and that whole element of it too, which has its own element, I'm sure. Again, history written by the winners, but I'm sure there was a lot of that whole white savior coming in. Yeah,
when you're talking about India and you're a white man, it's a minefield already. I mean, Islam as well, and him shooting a bunch of sword dashing Muslims too is just as much of that. But you have to go with that. You recognize that it's obviously you have to put that aside both for the time and also that it's an exotic foreign adventure. So you have to create bad guys wherever you go. That one just seems the most egregious. However, I would say as a real quick side note, it's the only one of the five films where he leaves the artifacts with the locals. He doesn't put it in a Western museum. He doesn't steal it and take it to, New York or London. So but it does have that going for it. He saves the day and he goes home.
Yeah. And then he leaves the stones with the villagers to,
exactly. Now, in a couple others, he didn't get them, like he didn't get the Holy Grail because he can't leave the cave or whatever. But the intention was to take it out of the country. Right. And places somewhere where, you can make money for it,
The famous line, this belongs in a museum, like everything, right?
And that's a whole other article. My archaeology friends, they both are probably archaeologists because of Indiana Jones, because he's so exotic and sexy and fun. And they also recognize the great conflict there where it's like he's about going around the world and stealing shit and bringing it back.
Yeah, that's fair. Before we leave Temple of Doom, was there anything about the movie's historical depictions that might surprise someone who has only seen the movie and hasn't dug into the true story?
I think it's less the cultural than it's historical. I think there's so little history in there that it's really just, I think that how the culture is sort of dismissed and marginalized is the thing that resonates with me today. It's all creative. It's all total fantasy. So in a way, it's kind of hard to badmouth it for taking something and beyond making the lingams, something else. They didn't recreate history because there was really little history there to recreate.
Fair point. All creative license for sure.
Exactly. Ain't no one flew me over this. There's nothing in here.
Right. Well, if we go back to the movies, we're to what is my personal favorite in the franchise, 1989's Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. And the artifact that Indy is searching for this time is the Holy Grail, the cup said to have been used by Jesus at the Last Supper and then caught his blood at the crucifixion. The Last Crusade is set in 1938. And so the Nazis are back as the main villains, and they're also searching for the Holy Grail and the eternal life that it provides for anyone who drinks from the cup. Is it true that the Nazis searched for the Holy Grail?
It's the same with the Ark. They didn't specifically said, let's go find the Grail, but it was all part and parcel of them trying to harness the occult and the minds and spirits of the people in Germany and elsewhere. So it wouldn't surprise me because the Ark and the Grail, probably one of the reasons why they're the two strongest one in the franchise, is they are real artifacts. I've done more Ark and Grail shows than any other. I just did one. I'm working on a History Channel show right now about both of them. They're both of them. This is the same story over and over again. You never get tired of those stories. But the Holy Grail is interesting. Unlike, I think that's why it's a C+, is that so much was added. The Grail itself a little more mundane. It never had any spiritual. It never had any other dimension. The Holy Grail, it doesn't even come from the Bible. There's no mention of it in the Bible. It comes from the 12th century, the Arthurian legend and Parsifal and all that kind of stuff. And it was clearly created after the fact, and it was all about trying to find this magical cup. And the idea of eternal youth, eternal life was something that was added much later. If you look at stuff from the time period, it would usually regenerate you, it would give you almost absolution, but it wouldn't keep you young forever. I think probably Wagner did an opera on Parsifal, which was world famous back in the day, and even in that one, which is all about the fantastical, it was all about Parsifal basically becoming free of all his guilt and all that. Basically the best confession ever. All sins are eradicated. That's what the Grail did when you had it then. So even the idea of the eternal life and all that, it was added by the screenwriters just for this film.
It was added for this film, or was that something that was like...
it maybe came before then. Maybe there might have been other the lore that came later, but that was not the typical. If you talk about, like, we know the Ark, everyone agrees the Ark will melt you, or will kill you, or you'll break out in boils. We just play with the facts a bit. If you look at the tradition of the Holy Grail, where and when that came up is not a big thing, and you might want to double check your facts afterwards. But as far as I know, that was the first time I ever heard of it giving you eternal youth.
I was wondering if maybe it was like a translation thing, because over time, there's so many different ways that people could translate regeneration. Maybe some might think it's more spiritual or physical, or, all of these things, and just using all of it.
It very well could be all that stuff, exactly. Yeah, and it kind of took elements of the Fountain of Youth and all that in there too, all the classic tropes we have of looking for something magical. So I think it could kind of become literally a repository for whatever you want it to be.
Well, you already mentioned them earlier, and I want to talk about a little bit from this one. Indiana Jones is searching for clues left by the Knights Templar to eventually find it leads him to the Canyon of the Crescent Moon. That's where it turns out one of the surviving members of the Knights Templar used the Grail himself to gain eternal life, and he's there guarding it. And at the end of the movie, the Grail gets lost again as the cave collapses, because, as the Knight explains to Indy, you can't take it past the Great Seal. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. I believe they used the real-life location of Petra in the country of Jordan for that part of the movie. But can you fill in some historical context around the connection of the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail?
Well, I've done so many Templar shows. People love the Templars. They are the ultimate Rorschach test of, weird medieval, magic. First of all, Petra is one of my I love Petra. It's one of my favorite sites in the world. I've been to 70-some countries, and I would say Petra is my top 5 places everyone should have on their bucket list. Now, it's funny, when you come down, you see Petra, that's called the Treasury, and you come down a wadi, which is an empty riverbed, a dry riverbed, and the first thing you see when you turn a corner is the Treasury, where they shot the exterior. Now, if you go in the interior, you're greatly disappointed, because it was just a tomb for a 1st century AD king, but at the same time as like Augustus in that period, and it's just an unfinished room. The sarcophagus is even gone. So you go in, it looks like a parking garage. It's nothing like the set there.
There's no booby traps and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah. Once you walk in, it's like, oh, where's the old knights? And, where's all the soaring temples and stuff? Nope. The outside is where you take your photos. But Petra is an amazing, amazing site. Now, the Knights Templar is fascinating, because I've done so many shows, and every one of them is about what they found and what they didn't find. The Grail was one of them. And the reason that they kind of become the sort of like go-to for any lost artifact from the Holy Land is because they were the pilgrims that let people get from Jaffa, from the shores of Israel to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem, which is about an hour or two today by car. It's probably a couple of days there. So they were pilgrims to get back and forth. They became very, very rich because of that, because of all the taxes. And they were given the prime real estate in Jerusalem, which is the Temple Mount, where the Temple of Solomon was, where the Great Rock is today, the Dome of the Rock, all that stuff. And the theory was they were sitting on all the stuff that was hidden during the Temple days, including the Ark, which was sacked several times, the Babylonians, and sacked by the Romans. I think it was the Babylonian one where they hid it, disappeared in history back then. So one of the theories is they took it, they spied it out. But again, none of this has any basis in fact. I did a show, probably one of the worst shows I ever did, on the Knights Templar, about saying they didn't find the Holy Grail, but they found the head of Christ. And a guy actually wrote a book and published it and said the head of Christ was spirited out by the Knights Templar into a chapel in Scotland called Roslin Chapel. It's a wonderful little weird temple outside of Edinburgh. Da Vinci Code takes place there. If you go there, it's super, super weird. And he claimed to even have all these facts about where exactly it was hidden in a secret chamber underneath the altar in Roslin Chapel. And that's where you would find the head of Christ. And he sold this book on it. And so I was there years later. I mean, it was just one of my first shows I did back in the 90s. And I was there shooting one time, and it was very expensive, I remember, to get permits. So I pretended like I was a tourist. Rather than pay like 10,000 pounds, I went in there, I got some really, really good slow pans, far better than a tourist would get, and find a custodian. The guy raking the leaves came up to me and says, "What the hell are you really here for? You're not just some holiday." And no one was around. It was late. I went inside, but I couldn't shoot inside. It was illegal to shoot inside if you have a permit. And I told him, I said, "Well, actually, I hear the head of Christ is here." He goes, "Oh, is that what it is this week? Is that what?"
Is that what That's what it is this week? Oh.
He goes, "Oh, that last week it was the Grail." Okay. He goes, "Okay, you turn your camera off. I will show you the head of Christ, but you cannot videotape it. And your sound guy was like hiding out behind that tree trying to get good audio of me. Has to shut it off and wait a minute." So the custodian, just as the place was closing, he took me in. He goes, "Okay, your camera's off, right?" And he walked in, and it's a weird looking chapel. It's festooned with all these strange carvings, and it's very odd. And it was made by descendants of the Templars. Some did actually escape to Edinburgh, the 1300s, 1400s. So there is some cause for there was some connection, however tenuous. But he took me behind the altar, and lo and behold, there was a door that went down, or it was stairs that went down there. And it was very dark. And he kept saying, "Okay, no camera, right? No camera." And this is one of my first films, that Kid in a Candy Store. I can't believe I'm going to score so big on my third film for television, whatever. So he gets down there, and he gets his keys out, and there's a big oak door, and with a big, brass knob, and he opens it up. He goes, "You ready to see the head of Christ?" "Yes, sir, I am." And he opens it up, and there is a sink and a bucket and a mop. And he takes his rake, and he sets it in the janitorial closet, and he closes it. He goes, "There's your head of Christ." And
wow.
That's what the Knights Templar are. That's a long way to say the Knights Templar is everything you want them to be, and they're nothing.
Okay. Yeah, until you just don't look behind the door.
Exactly.
Just don't look behind the door.
The man behind the curtain. Exactly. It taught me very, very early on to question everything. As a TV producer, it's easy. People are selling a book, or someone has a great idea, and invariably we're always chasing. You don't want to do the boring story that's all registered in fact. You want to do something that has a sense of mystery, like Indiana Jones or whatever, and that's what History Channel, Geographic, BBC, other people I work for, that's what they chase. But it's up to the producers to kind of not get caught up in that, because at the end of the day, you'll be sorely disappointed in most cases. And there's Knights Templar there. There's somewhere else in Roslin Chapel, there's a bunch of strange carvings that someone claimed is a map of the New World, and that's where the Templars took the Holy Grail. So it's somewhere in Mexico or something. So again, people are always looking for that answer. The Knights Templar is a perfect people to do that, because they were mysterious, they were on the Temple Mount, and they were totally massacred. They were wiped out. So the thinking was they had some hidden story that the King of France was trying to get, which is why he massacred them on Friday the 13th, by the way, which is why we have Friday the 13th.
And I know I've heard some conspiracies of were they actually all taken out, or did they just go underground, right? Then it throws up even more questions.
Come back to Scotland, because there are some Templar graves up in Edinburgh. So they didn't all go radical. I mean, they didn't happen to all be in Paris on that night or whatever. But it's a great story. I love the Knights Templar. They're going to keep giving and giving and giving. But their connection to the Holy Grail is as tenuous as the head of Christ.
Yeah, well, at least, I'm curious then, because speaking of the Knights Templar being just a popular thing that people love to hear about even today, you have the Knights Templar and the Holy Grail tied in Indiana Jones. What is the current train of thought? Are there still people that are searching for the Holy Grail today?
Yeah, I think it's the Holy Grail. It's kind of become the byword for it. You talk to a physicist, or you talk to a paleontologist. Oh, we use the Holy Grail as a thing they're trying to find. So of course there's people looking for the real deal. Again, it doesn't exist. And if it did exist, it was melted down or disappeared. It was just a cup. The whole idea, it's only mentioned in passing in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament is, they drank there, and then not even Joseph of Arimathea and all these kind of things that come after the fact. But the fact that a regular cup could survive this long is even less likely than the Ark, because it probably wasn't even venerated until much, much later.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That makes sense.
I'm sure that somebody wasted their money looking for it, and then probably said they found a cup somewhere in, like, some church in Krakow, and they claim that's the one. But they'll sell a book, but chances are could be another janitor closet.
Well, as we finish up The Last Crusader, is there any other historical aspects from the film that we haven't talked about that you think would be a surprise to viewers?
Well, one thing I learned, because I've shot there so many times, and I think it's so ridiculous when I watch that film today, is you go on the catacombs under Venice, and that's where they find it. Venice is a friggin' island. You dig 2 feet down and you flood everything. There are no catacombs in Venice. It is sinking. The last thing you want to do is build a basement in Venice.
That's a very good point that they just don't seem to address in the movie.
They just move on. There's some water down there. It is a bit leaky, but you know what? The last thing you're going to do is build a basement in Venice.
It's a good point. It's a very good point. Well, let's fast forward about 19 years between The Last Crusade and the next movie in the franchise, 2008's Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. And there's a scene in the beginning of the movie where we're introduced to Shia LaBeouf's character, Mutt, and he tells Indy that one of his old colleagues who helped raise Mutt, Professor Oxley, is down in Peru, and that's where he found the crystal skull. To quote Mutt in the movie, it's like that one guy that Mitchell Headkiss, he has mispronunciation trying to find it. That skull, the one that he found. And then Indy corrects him on the name. Goes on and gives us a little bit more background on the Mitchell Hedges skull. It's Mesoamerican. There are multiple skulls in the world, according to Indiana Jones, and it's interesting craftsmanship, but that's about it. And then we find out, Mutt's says Oxley's off to Akator, which is kind of reminds me of the throwback to Tanis, kind of like, oh, this is the location that we have to go to start. According to this one, it's Akator's where the skull was found, and that sparks Indy's interest. Akator goes by another name in the movie, El Dorado, the City of Gold. So that's kind of how the movie sets up. The reason for the storyline is them heading down to Peru to find Oxley, the Crystal Skull, and Akator. Can you help us separate fact from fiction in the movie's narrative?
Well, there's a lot more fiction than fact here, but yeah. There was a Mitchell Hedges, and he's interesting, and they say he might have been one of the prototypes for Indiana Jones, among others. He was a charlatan/adventurer in the 30s, and he claimed to have found one of the crystal skulls in Belize, actually. I forget the name of it. It's an archaeological site I've been to. It's a Mayan site, a classic-era Mayan site, which is down south, almost along the Guatemalan border. It's a small site, but it's got some really cool pyramids and things. But he claimed to have found it there, and then with his daughter or something, and they just didn't talk about it for a long time. But then later on, there was some reveal that he actually bought it at Sotheby's in like 1948 or something. Somebody else, and there was no record whatsoever of crystal skulls. And there wouldn't be because the Mayans just didn't have crystal skulls. And all 13 of these skulls, I think there's 13 of them in existence. They think they were all made by a French guy in like the just before the war to sell, crap to tourists, big artifacts, to get them on Sotheby's. And if you look at them now, and I've only seen one behind glass, I've never touched it, but you actually see modern machinery was carved. It could, for the Mayans in like the 1200s to build this out of quartz, it would have taken them, 100 years or something to polish it this way. There are actual traces of modern machinery, like diamond cutting devices.
That's because the aliens gave it to them.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I mean, it's exactly. I mean, this one above all of them. Not only I think it's the worst film in terms of the story and the characters and all that stuff, but it's the most ancient alias. It's the stuff that I've been trying to run away with all my career on television. It's the people I skewer in my books. I'm writing books about a cheesy time-traveling TV crew. This is very much based on that kind of crew, where everything's a conspiracy and everything's rubbish, So there's nothing there, and except for basing that on some snippets like El Dorado. Obviously people were looking for El Dorado, and there were a lot of Spanish conquistadors looking for El Dorado. Of course, they never found it. And most of those were down south as well, in South America, not in Mayan area. So they're blending all that stuff together for some sort of like ooga booga show, as we would call it.
Okay, yeah, that was going to be my next question, because the movie does mention the Spanish conquistador Francisco de Orellana, I think, who disappeared looking for El Dorado in 1546. So I'm assuming, was he a real person, or was it just kind of the concept of Spanish conquistadors?
He was real. He was real, and actually, he's known more famously for finding. He sailed the beginning and the end of the Amazon, so he charted the Amazon.
Wow.
And
okay.
then this was mid 15s. I forget the dates. And then he went back, and then under a Portuguese flag for some reason, he went back to start a colony. I think the Portuguese wanted to settle there on the mouth of the Amazon. And he was looking for El Dorado as he went. Anyone who went over to the New World was looking for El Dorado, among other things, as well as, but mostly it was about a benchmark, a toehold for one of the governments who paid for the expedition. So they could, what they ultimately did, so they could exploit the locals and get the land. Is exactly what happened. And he did not disappear. He died. They know exactly what happened to him. Have you ever seen one of my favorite movies of all time, Aguirre, Wrath of God? Do you know this film by Werner Herzog?
Yes, I haven't seen it in a long time.
Oh, watch it. It's fantastic. It's very much based on him, among other people, but they took a lot of what happened to him, and he basically went. They got lost a second time. They lost ships. There was infighting. They got sick. He went off to find help and died along the way. His wife was left behind, kind of like in Aguirre. And some people did survive, but he just died. They say he went mad. Again, Aguirre. But it's all well documented at the time, and people did survive. And his idea then was not to look for the city of gold, but to create, to put a Portuguese flag in the earth so they could exploit it.
Well, we've already talked about the Nazis' search for artifacts in some of the other movies, but in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, that's set in 1957. So at this time, the villains are the Soviets, and they're looking for powers provided by the secrets of the Crystal Skull, which, again, very similar to what we saw with the Nazis looking for artifacts before. But is it true that the Soviets were searching for supernatural artifacts too?
Not that I'm aware of, no. I think they just swapped out Nazis for the next villain of the time,
Yeah, the Cold War next. Okay.
They don't put in the Iraqis or the Vietnamese, it depends on when they made the film. I mean, as far as I know, they were not looking for that. I think, the Soviets are just more interested in just real world domination as opposed to, finding some sort of magical stone somewhere. They certainly probably wanted to ride roughshod over the locals as well and get those things done for themselves. They certainly had a lot of missiles over there. But as far as that's all BS, I think.
Okay. Well, we talked very briefly about it, but I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about the elephant in the room with the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and that is the way it ends, because that's when we find out the Crystal Skulls are the skeletons of interdimensional beings, that we see this huge UFO taking a portal to some other dimension after they return the skull. And the movie makes the point that say that they're not aliens from space, but they look a lot like the stereotypical aliens that we would expect to see. And that leads me into something I'm sure a lot of people watching right now are thinking. A lot of the stuff in the movie that we see, from the Crystal Skulls to the Nazca lines in Peru, are also talked about on the History Channel show Ancient Aliens, of course, which started actually about a year after Kingdom of the Crystal Skull came out in 2008. I don't know if there's any connection between those two things necessarily, but I have a two-part question about this. First, based on your experience, do you believe there's any truth to the concepts proposed in the movie that tie these ancient artifacts to UFOs? And secondly, from a kind of a more overall perspective, what's the general consensus for people that you've interacted with over the course of your career on whether or not there's a connection between these ancient artifacts like the Crystal Skull and even the Nazca lines, things like that, and UFOs?
Well, there certainly is, yeah. There's a lot you can talk about and decode. There's certainly so much of what I've done is sort of disputing a lot of that stuff. And Ancient Aliens did not invent the idea of the aliens. That goes back to Chariot of the Gods in the 70s, even before. I think, it was, what's this guy's name? I forget his name, but German guy who did Chariot of the Gods.
Oh, Doniken, I think.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, and all that stuff goes back to the idea that it couldn't possibly have been humans that did this. We had to have some help. The very first show that I made, it was my thesis film in school, so I was young and naive, but I was able to pull it off, was about the restoration of the Great Sphinx. And through a friend's father who was on the Antiquities Board in Egypt, I was able to go over there and actually climb the Sphinx and watch them restore it. It was amazing for a 23-year-old kid. And one of the amazing reasons I got the access is because at the same time that I made that film, eventually saw the Discovery Channel, but it was just going to be my thesis film at the time, was because there's a big popular show that had just aired, 1994, with Charlton Heston claiming the Sphinx was 10,000 years old. guy named Robert Schoch and some other geologists claim that by water erosion on the Sphinx, they proved that it was not made by, it was 10,000 years old. So that the pyramids were 4,500 years, the Sphinx was 4. So therefore, they quickly jumped to saying it wasn't built by the pharaonic people. It was built by an ancient alien race who came down 6,000 years before, built this thing, totally disappeared, and then a culture arose 3,000 years later and totally mimicked it. All based on one study of water erosion. And by looking at it, saying the water erosion proves that, it would take 10,500 years to do this. Yeah, they got Charlton Heston, Moses himself, to do a 2-hour NBC documentary on this, became a big thing. And here I am, a kid going over there, and these archaeologists, Zahi Hawass, and some of the people that run it, they were so incensed by this that they even let a young kid like me come over and talk about it so they could have a voice and explain why not. And in 20 minutes, they disputed it by looking at the way the Sphinx is built. It's multiple layers of stone. The head is much stronger than the body of the Sphinx, so it arose at a different rate. So the water erosion could have happened, but it happened when there was, channels and things and wind and all these things. So basically, they took one simple study and they allowed them to totally dispute and throw out hundreds of years of scholarly research by basically creating a question that they simply could not answer directly. It's the old adage, the lack of evidence is evidence. And that's what all these bogus alien shows are based on. It's kind of like you find one thing that we don't have bedrock proof of, and therefore you can create a completely new narrative that totally dismisses the ingenuity of the people who built it. It's insulting. There's a lot of colonialism there too. Early on, the Egyptians, they couldn't possibly do it. They need to have help. So there's so much stuff going on there that is so frustrating. And if people actually just broke down and looked at the bedrock reality, they can answer that stuff or find out there's more stuff to disprove this than this one little idea that you have that totally rewrites it. Now, that said, I don't know if there's aliens. I would think there are. It's hard to imagine we're alone in the universe. That's a different thing. It's hard to imagine this is the best we got, Surely someone's done it better than us, hopefully. But again, to bring it down to why all these things had to have been created by a foreign or by aliens, it's reductive and it's too easy, and it's frustratingly simple. And if you look at the archaeology, now archaeologists don't all have it all right. Archaeologists are always chasing themselves around, and I've gone and archaeologists are, they need to get thesis and get their doctorate too, and use other people with strum. And I'm not saying they have all the answers, but it's very, very easy. Like it's very convenient to use them as the villains. If you look at the people like Graham Hancock and those people who are doing all those Ooga Booga shows now, the new Nazis and the Soviets are archaeologists. They are hiding facts from us. They are coveting information, and they're not telling us what we really know. It's this whole Kennedy conspiracy all the way down. It's a conspiracy thing. The government is holding stuff from us, and the archaeologists are part of the government. They're funded by the universities, the elite towers. And so a lot of it is going after the elites. And there's great appeal for that. We see that in politics, and we see that in history and education. And, the Sphinx being 10,000 years old or being built by aliens fits right into that narrative.
Yeah, and what you were saying before about, it's very difficult to prove that. That when you were saying that, it reminded me of even like what you were talking about with the Holy Grail. It would be a cup. So how would we prove? And I mean, in the movie, of course, go back to Last Crusade, in that one with the Holy Grail, it is a very simple cup. But the only way that they're able to know that that's the Grail is because it's in this grand place, and all that old Knight Templar there and stuff. And how, if we were to find it today, or if we were to find proof of that today, how would we even know that that is actually proof? Nobody's ever going to open up that closet for you, right? The aliens aren't going to open up that closet for you to give you that.
No, exactly. Yeah, you listen to what janitors in the world who open up closets and says, "Here's your answer." And of course, if you find a cup, you find the Ark. There's no telling. The cup could be from anywhere, unless you have DNA of Jesus Christ, and we have DNA that we can compare it to where his lips touched it, which we do not and never will. And we can't prove that it was ever there. You can't date that kind of stuff. You can do carbon dating on some stuff, but you can't do it on petroglyphs and rock and things that are no longer have any carbon in it. So it's very, very difficult to say that. So that's why the crystal skulls, for example, why they fooled people for so long, because it's quartz, and you can't date quartz. It's only when people start looking at it and seeing modern trappings. So it's easier to dispute that stuff. You know, there are always people looking for an ark. I did an ark show years ago where some guy claims it's in a cave in the Judean desert, and he has a video of him, but he wasn't allowed to go in there because the Israeli government wouldn't let him, very conveniently. There's a videotape that he shot through a little hole. It was all over. You can Google it afterwards. It was BS. I mean, he probably just built this out of cotton candy or something and put it in the dark. But since we couldn't get there to break it down and see that he bought this at IKEA last year, then it always remains mystical. I hate to be cynical because I want to believe in this stuff. I mean, I would love to know if there's aliens. I would love to know how the pyramids and the Sphinx and all the places were built and what existed. But it's just too easy to basically say that, you know, this is the one. Jesus wore these glasses. But, you know, I can't give them to you to prove it right now because they have to go back to the shop. But trust me on this.
But trust me, yes. Don't look behind the door, but trust me, yes.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, the final movie in the franchise is 2023's Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. And again, in this one, the villains are the Nazis, but the movie is set in 1969, so it ties in Operation Paperclip when the U.S. government recruited former Nazi scientists. And in the movie, this Nazi scientist is led by Mads Mikkelsen's character, Dr. Voller. His plan is to use an ancient Greek device that they call the Antikythera to turn back time, because just like all the ancient artifacts that we see in Indiana Jones movies, this one has special powers, and this time, those powers are time. It's the power to alter time. So Dr. Voller has this plan to use the Antikythera to turn back time, to change history and restore the Nazi regime. Which parts of the movie's storyline there are based on real history?
Well, there is an Antikythera device. So that's beginning and end of what's true there.
Okay,
you
that's
see
it.
it at the Athens Museum, and it doesn't look quite as spectacular today because it's flattened and it's all made out of, it's all carbonized, so it's all very kind of greenish in the bottom of the sea. And it is a strange device because it came from 3rd century BC, and it is a machine. You know, it's got gears and wheels. It's all flattened like a pancake, but that is a real thing. And people, I've done many shows on that too, because people always been trying to suss out what it is. But in that regard, we do have a janitor who's opened the door. And it's pretty clear now that what it was a geared and wheels device that tracked the stars. There was solar, and each one was kind of able to tell the days and telling the star, the constellation. And it was probably in a wooden box that was carried around, and it went down on a ship that they found off the coast of Rhodes, I think, but don't quote me on that. So they do know that it was, they can kind of see that they were charting certain days and certain festivals, and it kind of makes sense. But the fact that they made it is really amazing because we did not think they had this technology, 3 centuries before Christ. So it really is a very, very strange thing. But what I love about that one is, like the pyramids or anything else, it proves the ingenuity of the people, not that they needed help from extraterrestrials. Greeks were a lot friggin' smarter than we thought they were, and they created this thing long before we ever did. So to me, that's what I love about history. It's like, who were these people? What I love about ancient history is, my God, they did all this shit long before we came along. We're standing on the shoulders of giants. So you look at the device and you think, oh my God, these people were a lot more clever than we give them credit for. Now, in terms of, it wasn't a time travel device. I wish it was. My books that I write are time travel, and I love time travel. I love to go back there and see what it was like. But it was more simply about, it was about charting the stars in a very defined, way. And I'm just charting them, and I'm probably dismissing it. It's really more about looking at, again, all the religious aspects and, say, the festivals and all those kind of things. It had a lot of complexities that are lost through time because we didn't understand the nuances of what they were using these charts for. But it's probably very accurate, and why we only found one was a prototype that was coming from Rhodes to the mainland or wherever and sank. We don't know. But it's really hard to find in the Athens Museum. You got to go way in the back. It's not nearly as impressive as like the frescoes that are on the Parthenon. It's tucked way in the back, and it's about this big, and it's Mona Lisa small. So you really miss it unless you're looking for it. But it's really what it represents more than its sheer beauty.
I like what you mentioned about how people then had this ingenuity that we often just don't associate with people of ancient times. Like we're the smartest the human race has ever been, and there's never been anybody smarter than us. So therefore, they had to have had help in some way, because there's no way that they could have done this. And I like
be more clever than us.
Right.
There's primitive people living in Africa of all places. Wherever it is, it's kind of I mean, there's a lot of ignorance there, and a lot of think that we are the best, and we've come across stuff the history that we like to think that history is always increasing. We're smarter now, but it's cyclical. Smarter than that guy who got a paintbrush at Lascaux Cave and put his hand on the wall. We just learned a lot more things along the way, but they had it all sussed out as well.
Yeah, yeah. One thing in the Dial of Destiny, mention of Operation Paperclip. I know that was a real thing, but then obviously the time travel aspect isn't necessarily true. But did we know if Nazi scientists who were recruited by the U.S. government with Operation Paperclip actually tried to restore the Nazi regime like we see happening in that movie?
No, why would they? I mean, the Nazi regime was dead and dusted by that point. Why you want to bring back the most evil empire ever? You were lucky to get the hell out of Germany. Thank God you were smart and understood physics, or you would be in prison over there, in Nuremberg as well. So I can't imagine anybody want to go back to those days.
No real Dr. Voller then, I guess. It's a good thing if you don't want that back.
They want to settle down in suburban Ohio and disappear and not talk about their past. They don't want to relive it.
Makes sense. Makes sense. At the very end of Dial of Destiny, the Nazis take Indy and his team hostage, and they use the Antikythera to go back in time using a World War II era bomber along with the fighter. But instead of going back to World War II, where they think they're going to go, they're actually taken all the way back to the year 212 BCE during the siege of Syracuse during the Second Punic War. The bomber gets hit by this large ballista bullet. It's kind of cool to see, the World War II era plane, and then this ancient battle going on. The ancient Romans are fighting there. They're the ones attacking Syracuse in the movie. And they immediately try to attack these, what they call them, flying dragons, because they don't know what they are as planes, right? The bomber crashes. We get to meet Archimedes, who tells Indy that he built the Antikythera as a way of getting help for the siege. No matter what, it would always take people back to that time and place. And then Indy wants to stay there because it's something he studied his whole life. But his partner throughout the movie, Helena, knocks him out. And then we see him waking up back in present day. He didn't get to stay there. I'm sure we could have an entire episode, just like all of these, we could have an entire thing just about each one. This one being about the siege of Syracuse. But do you think the movie did a good job with this storyline of the battle, Archimedes, siege of Syracuse, and all of that?
I mean, I love the fact that they did it. I love that period, the Greco-Roman period in ancient history. So I just applaud them for doing that. I think it was a fun ending. I was totally sucked into it. And again, it's not something that we know well today. So it was fun to go back to, the Punic Wars and see it. So again, A+ for doing that. Did it look like that? It's really kind of hard to know. I mean, there was a battle of Syracuse in 1212. Archimedes was there. He died there because they thought he was somebody else. They said, don't kill Archimedes. The Romans wanted to use him a la paperclip for their own devices. But someone didn't recognize him, I guess, because he didn't have a YouTube channel or whatever. And he gets stabbed in the head. So I think, for what it was, yeah, it transported me back there. These things are always, you always want to see more of it. When you see, all we saw is just that we just see like maybe one room and the shore. I want to go in ancient Syracuse. Give me a 2-hour tour. You can't get that. But for the little 10 minutes at the end or whatever, yeah, I thought I did a brilliant job of doing that. And I love time travel, knowing it doesn't exist. I think it's great fun to seeing when worlds collide. So I had a lot of fun with that, and I didn't roll my eyes anywhere.
Okay, yeah. You mentioned wanting to go back in time yourself. And as I was watching this movie for the first time in theaters, I almost thought that the entire franchise would end with Indiana Jones living out the rest of his days in ancient history. I do like how they ended it, though, because he does end up back home with Marion and Sala and Helena there as well. But as we wrap up our discussion today, if you had to live out the rest of your days at any time and place in history, when and where would you choose?
Oh, it's tough. I mean, first of all, I would love to have that device and go back there and save the Library of Alexandria. There's so many things that we could go back. Pompeii before it was destroying all the manuscripts there. I would take that device and just that's what he said. On the next series should be time traveling back there and getting artifacts when they're still new and fresh.
Yes, they're not artifacts as much as
exactly.
just objects.
Again, you're stealing because you're taking stuff in. You're screwing with time. The ripples of them. Again, I write time travel fiction, and I always realize, well, if I save somebody in Pompeii, what happens to their bloodline? Does it get wiped out? Or if I save this manuscript that should have disappeared, the ripple effect, you never know. But in terms of my own, I mean, I've been to so many countries and I've fallen in love with so many, but Egypt always held a special place for me. Egypt was a place I would go back to. I would go back to the Pyramid Age or go back to the New Kingdom and see Ramesses and what that was like, and King Tut's funeral, walk through Thebes at its height. That's how I like to spend my autumn years. So if you can work on that for me, if you know anybody on this podcast,
see what I can do. No guarantees, but I'll see what I can do. You mentioned wanting the device. If you were to oversee an Indiana Jones movie, what ancient artifact would Indy be searching for in your movie?
That's a good question. I thought about that. I mean, all the big ones, it's hard to know. I mean, again, if it wasn't time travel, it's hard to, yeah, for me, I like to go back. I mean, one of the shows, I did a show years ago on the Copper Scroll, which is fascinating, which exists. We know what the Copper Scroll is, but it's a great story. It's the only scroll found among the Dead Sea Scrolls that's made of copper. And it's a treasure map. And it was written by somebody in a hurry and built and buried in one of the Qumran caves. And it has all this, it's the world's, so we know, oldest treasure map, and it goes to all this lost gold from the temple where they all took it, maybe including the Ark. Now, it'd be fun to follow that. We have the Ark, but it'd be kind of fun to actually see where those places are. I did a show where I went to them, and, what used to be like a long tunnel into the ground is now like a car park in Tel Aviv. So I got there a bit late.
That's okay. Like the tunnels under Venice and in the Indiana Jones. Like, I mean,
I did in post.
In post, love it.
I don't know if that answers your question, because it's more time traveling, because we do have the artifact. But there's something about that story I always love, because it's a journey, and it'd be kind of fun to tell that story if you could somehow go to some places along the trail and introduce different places and different time periods.
Oh yeah, for sure. And also just the mere fact that it's the only one made out of copper, it sets itself as being different. Like, why is this one different? And then you start to get the supernatural or ancient alien aspect in there or whatever.
Has to be somebody has to melt.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we talked a lot about the real world influencing Indiana Jones movies, but throughout your career, have you seen it go the other way, where Indiana Jones movies have impacted people working in antiquities and archaeology?
I don't know how many people I see on my shoots that have, fedoras on. And many of them claim, I had it before Indiana Jones.
Right.
I was the original Indiana Jones. All right, if you want to feel that. But, I talk to archaeologists and Egyptologists and paleontologists the world over, and those films impacted them. And if you see them as a kid, you can understand why, because they're fun. They make it sexy and adventurous. And who doesn't want to be an adventurer going off? But it's also one of those things that they also get yelled at, because at the end of the day, he is a plunderer. The very opening scene of Raiders, which is I still think Raiders is the best film because it's the freshest. It surprised me the most. And even going back and looking at it again, it still holds up. There's not a bad frame in it, as long as you don't look at the questionable archaeology. Because the very first scene, he's in Peru, and he's stealing this golden idol, and he destroys all of his artifacts to do it. Here is this tomb no one has been to, just because he wants to nick this thing so he can take it back to the States. That entire temple is destroyed. Same thing later on when he and Marion are down there in the Well of Souls or whatever, and everything is destroyed because they had to go look around. So archaeologists recognize in all the films. What was one I just watched last week, and it was probably Last Crusade. The Petra place is all destroyed at the very end because they had to go poking around and being archaeologists. So every time you destroy that, it doesn't come back. It doesn't heal itself. So my archaeologist friends recognize, there's an old adage in archaeology anyway, that all archaeology is destruction. You bring something up that's been hidden for 3,000 years in the sand, and it starts to rot. There was one of the shows I was at, name of the Sphinx shows, one of my earlier shows, and it was one of the most exciting moments and also one of the most troubling moments I recognize what archaeology does and doesn't do. We were at the foot of the Sphinx, and there's a series of tombs down there. It was a Sphinx. It was a pyramid show I did. And there's a bunch of tombs they found that were the workers, the people that built the pyramids. And they always assumed they were slaves, a la 10 Commandments, that they had they were just dumped in the river, whatever. And here are these tombs, very modest tombs, beehive-like tombs that were found. And they're amazing. I don't know if you can go to them today because they're so fragile. But I was there when archaeologists was finding these tombs, and we were videotaping it for the show, and they opened up one of the tombs, again, just mud brick. And it was a very modest tomb with a guy. He wasn't mummified. He was in the fetal position. He was all skeleton. And two very modest clay jars on either side of him that he went off into the next world with. Maybe he'd held his organs. They call them canopic jars. Or maybe he was just taking his few modest possessions he had to the Duat, the next world. But as we're videotaping it, we get the cool shots, and then we pull back because we want to look at something and talk about something. And we came back and got our camera in there again. Both the jars had cracked. The modern air mixed in with that bubble of air that hadn't been touched in 4,500 years. 10 minutes of modern air destroyed those two clay things. Just like that. Now, these are, we have so many of those. The archaeologists weren't that upset because it wasn't like King Tut's gold or whatever. They were just pots and things like that. But it just shows you archaeology is destruction. So Indiana Jones is in there going through entire temples and watching them collapse so he can get one little artifact at the end. That's bad archaeology.
It's bad archaeology.
You would not get your PhD. Yeah.
You just roll the stone away at the beginning of Raiders. It's fine. It's perfectly fine, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Well, you mentioned Raiders was your favorite film. Is it because of that opening sequence, or is there a particular reason why?
It's one of the most dynamic openings. I just think that film, every second is fresh. And to my mind, it never quite captured. I do agree the Last Crusade came the closest, and it helped because it had great characters in it, particularly Connery. And it was fresh, and it was a great adventure. But they all sort of feel a bit samey. I enjoyed Dial of Destiny more than I thought I would. I thought Skull and Temple of Doom are terrible. I just can't rewatch them again. They're just kind of ugly and stupid. And the second one was kind of co-opted. By 1984, I'm old enough to remember that's when the age of the franchise and the big budget for kids came out. And, so that film was geared toward 12-year-olds. And it just felt, so it just didn't have this sense of wonder. Indiana Jones was just laugh out loud funny, that even when he did something outrageous, like the great chase scene underneath the car, he just laughed out loud. By the time he was doing it, jumping out of a plane on a raft in India, it starts to just feel like you're doing it just for the sake. So I like the films. Not to say, I think 3 of them I'd watch anytime. 1, 3, and the last one. I think they're great fun. The other 2, I just never warmed to. I keep trying to, but I could just never warm to them. And I think it's because the sense of joy was somehow missing. Doom is a dark film. It's very grisly and ugly. And Crystal Skull is just trash. Just trash. It's just like an old episode of, I don't know. I'm old enough to remember a show from the 70s, probably before your time, I don't know, called Kolchak the Night Stalker. You remember this show?
I'm not familiar with that one, no.
Yeah. They say that it only ran for a season, but it's a cult classic. They say that it inspired the X-Files. And it's Darren McGavin, who is the guy from Father's Story, the father from Christmas Story. And he's in a sear-sucking suit, and he goes around Chicago, and every week he finds vampires and zombies and UFOs. And he dispatches them all in an hour, because no one believes him, and he has to get on the wire. And he's a reporter that never gets... He was a lot of fun. It was a fun show because he was a lot of fun. And as a little kid, this is the mid-70s, they were wonderfully fun to watch because they were scary. And moss monsters in the sewer chasing around Chicago. He has to get a special fig to kill it or whatever, twig. But the special effects were so ropey. They had like $6.50, So they had a headless motorcycle guy, which clearly was the Sleepy Hollow story. And all it was a guy, doing this. And it was just so, you could tell they were desperate for ideas and desperate for cash, and they want to have fun, but they didn't know what to do with it. That's what Crystal Skull felt like. It felt like a Kolchak the Night Stalker episode with just too much money thrown at it. But without the sense of humor, without the sense of, at least Kolchak knew what it was. This just felt like something that was just sort of like, let's just take the most outrageous thing we can because we have to. And let's, throw some cash at it. And it didn't work. At the end of the day, I'm not sure exactly what he found at the end and why they left and what he learned. I was scratching my head at the end of that film thinking, this isn't archaeology anymore. This is just ooga booga.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it seemed different too, because it does, well, for one, those are the only two that are really, the Nazis are not villains, but also in Crystal Skull, it was, almost like an X-Files type ending, like where you're left with more questions than answers. Whereas with the others, at least you get a sense for, okay, they're being stored in some museum or whatever, but the story is kind of wrapped up. Like, okay, he got it. Or we found out that you can't, the power of God through the Ark of the Covenant is, something that you can't control, right? But you still figured out what was happening. Whereas
all of them kind of a good wrap up. I mean, the ending, that last shot of Raiders is brilliant. There's a cynical ending is so wonderful. All of this, and it gets tucked away somewhere in DC. And then Last Kingdom is satisfying too, because you see the cup disappear and they can't get it, but they know it exists. There's something that feels conclusive about it. But you're right, that one just feels like it's just a mess of just trying to dazzle us with oddities and I don't know, guys with doing this.
Yes, for sure. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show to chat about the true story behind the Indiana Jones movies. It's fitting that the franchise there kind of fits with a time traveling story, because as we've talked about kind of throughout, on top of all your experiences working on historical films yourself, you've also published your first novel recently called Primetime Travelers. And I know you have a new one out that's about Pompeii. So can you give listeners a peek into your book and where they can get a copy?
Yeah, and they pretty much came out of exactly what we're talking about. I've done 25 years of doing nonfiction television where it's all about buttoning it up and footnoting it. You work for National Geographic, you got to make sure you have 6 sources, for everything. So after a while, I kind of got tired of looking at ancient bleached ruins in the desert, and I wanted to have some fun with the past. And the only way to do that is fiction. So I took a TV crew very much like the ones I work with, and I have them time travel in the past. In the first one, they go back to the ancient Egyptian underworld looking for a lost mummy and to win an Emmy. And that's Primetime Travelers. And the second one that's in November is they go back with extra money because it's a big hit on TV, Pompeii, to go back to Pompeii and capture it in all its glory before it's destroyed. And it gives me a chance to kind of play with my day job and my love of history, but also in a very playful kind of way. Taking history and questioning what's true and what's not, going back in the past, you realize, it wasn't like that at all. So it's been a great fun to kind of dip into both wells and take the fiction and the nonfiction and kind of blur them into escapist. And they're both on Amazon. If you look for Neil Laird or Primetime Travelers or Primetime Pompeii, you can find them on Amazon or Kindle.
Fantastic. I'll make sure to include links to those in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time, Neil.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It was good fun.
This episode of Based on a True Story was produced by me, Dan Lefebvre. I'd like to thank Neil Laird once again for sharing some of the real history that we saw in the Indiana Jones franchise. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Neil has just released part 2 in his Jared Plummer vs. the Ancient World series, which is called Primetime Pompeii. Hop into the show notes to find where you can get your own copy right now. Or if you're driving, doing chores around the house, or just can't check the show notes for some reason, you can always find the link to that on the show's home on the web, basedonatruestorypodcast.com/356. Okay, now it's time for the answer to our 2 truths and a lie game from the beginning of the episode. And as a quick refresher, here are the 2 truths and 1 lie. Number 1, Tanis, the place we see Indy searching for the Ark of the Covenant, is actually a real location. Number 2, Temple of Doom has the most historically accurate of the artifacts that Indiana Jones is searching for in the franchise. Number 3, there's more than one crystal skull. Did you catch which one is a lie? Got the answer right here, so let's open up the envelope and find out. And the lie is number 2. Temple of Doom has the most historically accurate of the artifacts that Indiana Jones is searching for in the franchise. That's the lie. As we learned from Neil, the Sankara stones from Temple of Doom are based on Shiva Lingam stones that are quite common. And the idea of them being used by the Thuggee cult in Temple of Doom, that's all made up. I mean, we even learned that even though the Thuggees were real, it wasn't a cult, they were more like bandits, and not a supernatural cult trying to kidnap kids like we see in the movie. Oh, and while I am calling number 3 true, you'll get an honorable mention if you pick that one. We did learn that the crystal skulls are real artifacts, and even the one mentioned in the movie, the Mitchell Hedges skull, is a real thing. And Neil pointed out that there's more than a dozen of them in existence. and the true story behind them has been debated for decades, but it's pretty safe to say that the story about them being from interdimensional aliens, like the movie says, is made up. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you're on the video version of this. As a solo podcaster, these episodes would not be possible without the support of Based on a True Story producers. And if you're watching the video version of this, we're going to have credits roll at the end, so I'd encourage you to stick around for those. And if you want to get your name in the video credits for the next episode, you can learn how to do that over at basedonatruestorypodcast.com/producers. Until next time, thanks so much for spending your time with Neil and I today, and I'll chat with you again really soon.